Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar on Islamophobia in our public schools. I will be your host, and my name is Yasin Abshir. I am an Associate Education Ombuds at the Washington State Governor's Office of the Education Ombuds, also known as OEO. OEO works with families and schools across the state to resolve problems that impact student learning. We also work to promote equity in education and envision an equitable system that is responsive and accountable to every child in our state of Washington. This webinar topic aligns with both the mission and vision of this office. And just as a little housekeeping before we get started, this webinar is being recorded. So please mute your phone if you are dialing in and mute your mic if you are joined by the computer. Unfortunately, due to time constraints, we will not be able to answer questions during the webinar. However, please do write down any questions or comments that you may have and send them by email. We will get back to you as soon as possible. I am joined by panelists Shukri Olo from Seattle Public Schools and student activist Ahlam Ibrahim. While we are all aware of the current political climate in our country, we will keep this discussion focused on the impact of Islamophobia on students and the resources available in our school system and how to access them. Now, without further ado, I will let the panelists introduce themselves.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Shukri Olo from Seattle Public Schools. I implement a federal Race to the Top education grant that seeks to close the opportunity gaps impacting African and African American students in the Southeast. I'm also a product of our public education system. I graduated from Auburn High School, went on to do graduate work at Seattle University. I have a degree in Master's in Public Administration. It's a pleasure to be joining you all this afternoon. First, I want to thank Ahlam Ibrahim and Yasin Abshir from the Governor's Office of Education Ombuds for making this webinar possible, and thank you all for being here.
My name is Ahlam Ibrahim. I'm a student at the University of Washington, though majoring in education and informatics. I co-founded Global Islamophobia Awareness Day, an initiative aimed to combat Islamophobia and make this world a better place.
Thank you guys for both being here. So I'll look at our agenda briefly. Up next, we will get the background on Islam, followed by a definition of Islamophobia, and then we'll have our discussion on Islamophobia in schools, with Shukri and Ahlam providing examples. Afterwards, we'll watch a brief PBS NewsHour clip on Islamophobia. After that, I'll provide an update on HIB protections at our school. HIB stands for harassment, intimidation, and bullying. We'll round up our discussion on what educators, families, and communities can do to combat Islamophobia. So,
the definition of Islamophobia that we'll be using this afternoon is from the UC Berkeley Center for Race and Gender. It defines Islamophobia as a contrived fear of prejudice fomented by the existing Eurocentric and Orientalist global power structure. It is directed at a perceived or real Muslim threat through the maintenance and extension of existing disparities in economic, political, social, and cultural relations, while rationalizing the necessity to deploy violence as a tool to achieve civilizational rehab of the target communities, Muslim or otherwise. Islamophobia reintroduces and reaffirms a global racial structure through which resource distribution disparities are maintained and extended.
Wow, that is an all-encompassing definition.
I chose this definition because UC Berkeley is doing an Islamophobia research and documentation project. They hold an annual conference in which scholars, researchers, community members are invited to discuss Islamophobia. And this April, on the 21st through the 23rd, they will hold the 8th edition of that conference.
And how do you see Islamophobia playing out in the schools?
Well, the dislike of or prejudice against Muslims, which is a simpler definition, can play out through harassment, intimidation, and bullying, also discrimination.
Perfect. Thank you very much for that. Ahlam, can you give us some background information on Islam?
Yeah, so Islam is the world's second most common religion. At 1.6 billion Muslims, they are 23% of the global population. So Muslims are the followers of Islam. Their holy book is the Quran. And the foundation of Islam, which all Muslims believe, is the 5 pillars of Islam, which are believing in one God, the prayer, fasting in the month of Ramadan, giving charity, and performing pilgrimage to Mecca if one is able to. Also, the Muslim holy book is the Quran. And Muslims believe Prophet Muhammad was the last messenger of God. So that's the brief background on Islam.
the way that Islamophobia can play out in our schools include, well, the dislike of or prejudice against Muslims, which is a simpler definition, can play out through harassment, intimidation, and bullying, also discrimination.
Thank you for that, Shugri. Now, let's move on to the discussion of Islamophobia in schools. Can you guys give us any examples of Islamophobia when you were either students or family members that you know of that went through Islamophobic incidents?
So I graduated from Rainier Beach High School. It's like a really diverse school, so there's not a lot of, I would say, Islamophobia, but after attacks or something that happened that was connected to Muslims in the media, you would see a lot of students being harassed and being asked questions about Islam. For instance, I had a student told me, why am I always defending a terrorist group? Because I was always really vocal about Islamophobia, and I just had to explain to her the difference between me and them and how we're not the same people and how my religion preaches peace. So I would say a lot of students, it's just mainly misunderstanding, and also how in our public education there's no really religion discussions. That also makes it hard for Islam to be discussed in schools.
And after those incidents, how does that environment impact the student?
Well, like, you don't feel welcome in your school because your school is your second home, so you start questioning if these people truly care about you. And also when teachers do not defend the students during harassment, that can also cause a lot of other issues.
Okay. And so how do you work out? Did you reach a resolution?
Yeah, I just explained to the student why I wasn't the same as that terrorist organization, but my teacher could have stepped up and easily did that with a class discussion, because like I'm pretty sure she was not the only one who felt that way, but I just was able to just speak to her about it.
Okay. Well, thank you for doing that. What about you, Shugri? Do you have any examples?
Yeah, so I'll give you an example. One being sort of the best case scenario on how we choose to manage when we see incidents like this, and the other being kind of the worst case scenario. One example is of a young fourth grader in our schools who was bullied because of the garment on her head, her hijab. And there was one student in particular that was doing the bullying. There weren't many adults around when that student was bullying the Muslim girl. And finally, the Muslim girl chose to tell an adult, and in this case, it was her teacher. When the teacher heard about the incident, she decided to use that as a learning opportunity for everyone in the classroom, instead of kind of taking out the kid that was doing the bullying and having a side conversation with that student. The teacher decided to create an activity in her classroom that could provide additional support to that Muslim child. And so the activity was around identity, and the teacher had every student do the "Where I'm From" poem in her classroom, talking about where they're from. And in particular, what was interesting was the teacher didn't tell the other 20 students in the classroom to do it about themselves, but to write an activity about why the hijab is beautiful on that specific Muslim child that was being bullied. And so when it was time to present their activity, the Muslim girl who was being bullied presented on the importance of her hijab, what it meant to her identity, how she feels, that she loves wearing it, that it's who she is. And everyone in the classroom also did a poem on what the hijab means and why it's beautiful on that child. And so it was a really beautiful moment to see that everyone was, showing solidarity and accepting that child and going above and beyond. And I think that was sort of a best case scenario. And moments like that could be a teaching moment for not just the child who's doing the bullying, but for all the kids who are also, witness to that. Sort of the best, the worst case scenario in this was, another example is a Muslim student, a fifth grader who his name was Muhammad, who was being bullied as well. He was called a terrorist by another student. And everyone kind of knew the other students. It's interesting how students always know what's going on, but oftentimes the adults aren't aware. And everyone kind of knew in that child's surrounding what was going on. And then finally, the child was fed up and decided to fight back. And when he chose to fight his bullier, they were both suspended for 3 days. And later on, it was found out that the student fought and because he was being bullied because of his identity. And so in that moment, I'm sure that that experience didn't necessarily feel good for that student, and it could have been handled in a different way as well.
Thank you for those examples. But Ahlam has watched the video previously and will give us a summary.
So the video took place in St. Cloud, Minnesota. And in St. Cloud, recently there has been a huge new Somali population. For those who don't know, Somalis are from Somalia, a country that's like 99% Muslim. So the community and the schoolings were not used to a large proportion of Muslim students within their education system. So this caused a lot of prejudice and Islamophobia happening in the schools. And the teachers, thankfully, and the school administrations wanted to change this. So if I recall, they started like a diversity group, and this group would have discussions and stuff about Islam, but also other cultures after schools and stuff like that. And they hosted an assembly, and the school environment started changing gradually. They said they started doing this every year.
And was it led by the district, or was it started by the students?
Yeah, the director of race and equity with St. Cloud district started the initiative, and it was sort of a peace circle kind of environment where students, Muslim students and other students who were allies in this conversation did a circle and would talk about their experiences in ways that other students in their district can learn about Muslims in their city. So it created an environment of dialogue and understanding, and I think that's what worked well. There was, I think, one specific incident that provoked, conversation about Islam and Islamophobia in St. Cloud, and particularly in that school district, where a Muslim girl who was also in a wheelchair, picture was taken by another student on Snapchat, and then that was showcased to other students, and then Muslim Somali girls in particular heard about the incident and decided to boycott the school for, I think, about a day. And then that's when the district stepped in and wanted to manage the situation a bit better than, how it transpired.
Thank you for the recap, guys. So we'll move on to protections that are in place at the schools. So in Washington State, under RCW 28A.300.285, it defines harassment, intimidation, or bullying as any intentional, electronic, written, verbal, or physical act shown to be motivated by any of the following characteristics: the victim's race, color, religion, ancestry, national origin, gender, sexual orientation, or mental, physical, and sensory handicap, and when that intentional, written, verbal, or physical act physically harms a student or damages the student's property, or has the effect of disrupting the student's education, or is so severe, persistent, or pervasive that it creates a hostile environment, or has the effect of disrupting the orderly operations of the school. Schools are required to take action if students report bullying, and since 2011 in Washington State, every school district must have an anti-bullying policy and procedure in place. Each district also has a harassment, intimidation, and bullying compliance officer. Now, if the student has experienced a pattern of harassment, intimidation, or bullying, a school can develop a safety plan to ensure that both the student and staff have strategies to prevent reoccurrences, as well as a safe way to respond to any future incidents. And there are 4 action steps for developing that plan. The first would be to request a meeting to develop a safety plan with your school team. In that meeting, you will identify 2 to 3 adult staff members in the building that the student feels safe going to if they feel emotional or physically threatened. And then you would consider setting up daily or weekly check-ins with one of those designated safe people. And usually those people can be a student's elementary homeroom teacher, a middle school, high school counselor, or an IEP case manager. Now, it's a great idea to communicate with all these staff members about their roles in the student safety plan. Establish student pass in case the student needs to leave a classroom to contact one of their safe people. Ensure that the safe people have reporting forms they can help fill the student out if an incident occurs. And communicate with all the students' teachers, including bus drivers and other staff, so that they're aware of the safety plan. Now that's with harassment, intimidation, and bullying. But then there's also discrimination. Schools are already required to take action if a student reports they are being bullied under harassment, intimidation, bullying policy requirements. But there's also, bullying can be classified as a discriminatory harassment. And discriminatory harassment is based on a protected class. And that harassment is based on a protected class and creates a hostile environment. So under Title IV of the Civil Rights Law, it gives students additional protections against discriminatory harassment. If an investigation reveals that bullying was based on a student's protected class and created a hostile environment, staff must act quickly to stop the behavior and put an end to the hostile environment. The school must make sure that harassment does not happen again. Also, the school must protect parents and students from retaliation by other students or school employees because they communicated concerns about discriminatory harassment, filed a complaint, or participated in the investigation. And even if the parents or student does not file a complaint, schools must take steps to protect students and investigate as soon as they know or reasonably should know that discriminatory harassment is taking place. All right, Ahlam al-Shukri. We'll move on to what educators, families, and communities can do to combat Islamophobia in our public schools. Who wants to get us started?
So I just want to be able to contextualize the conversation. Although it is focused on Islamophobia in our schools, it's much bigger than that. Islamophobia shows up in all sectors and all kind of, settings in our country. And since 9/11, there have been documented hate crimes against Muslims by the Southern Poverty Law Center. And in every election cycle, that hate crimes against Muslims and other minority groups also go up. In our own state, I think it was in the town that I live in Kent, there was a Sikh man who was shot at because the perpetrator thought he was a Muslim. In Arizona, there was a mosque that the Quran in the mosque were destroyed. In Texas, there was a masjid that was burnt down. And also in Bellevue, there was a masjid that was burnt down because and folks are still thinking that it was a hate crime. And so if all of that is happening in our nation, it's going to show up in our local community as well. Call it trickle-down hate. And it's showing up in our education system. And I want to give you kind of 4 points that I think could combat Islamophobia, specifically in our schools. One is that all schools need to recognize that anti-Muslim bias is a form of racism, and the tools that schools have developed to address other forms of racism, examples being anti-Black, anti-Latino, anti-Asian, anti-Jewish, and anti-Native American, could be adapted to address this newer ugly phenomenon. Two is that school administrators should take and include lessons on what constitutes Islamophobia and provide strategies to confront it. It is part of our civil rights and sensitivity training for teachers and faculty. Teachers should also receive training and support dedicated to fighting anti-Muslim bullying. School assemblies and other events could address racism or bullying where appropriate and could include the mention of anti-Muslim prejudice. Teachers, including school staff as well, could receive professional development training on Islamophobia so that he or she has the knowledge base to be able to be an ally, and going beyond what it means to be an ally, but maybe an accomplice in actually providing that extra step needed for our students. The third point is teachers should also make sure that classroom material on Islam and Muslims is free of bias. We all, as human beings, have implicit bias, and it's different when that bias is reflected in our classroom, in our spaces where children are seeing that, and it's visible for everyone to see. And when discussing sensitive topics like 9/11 or ISIS, Muslim students should not be singled out or made to defend their religion. I remember when I was in 9th grade, an incident must have happened in the Middle East. And my history teacher kind of looked at me and said, Shukri, do you know what's going on? Would you like to explain to the class what this is? And as a 9th grader and, as a child, I didn't know how to respond to that. And it's one thing to have the students defend the actions of a few crazy people, and it's completely, I think, hurtful for those students to be able to do that. And then there's also having students apologize for the acts of those people that many of us don't even know about. And so we want to kind of stay away from those kinds of finger pointing and having students be defending their identity. The last piece is school districts should develop appropriate responses to support responsible teachers and faculty who oppose anti-Muslim hatred and or teach about Islam in a sensitive and sensible fashion. I believe there were a few cases of college professors who showed solidarity and allyship who were fired from their position. I remember a professor who wore a hijab, I think it was in Virginia, and she was fired because she wore a hijab. And so we want to be praising those acts of solidarity and not punishing people for showing allyship.
Something I want to add as well is I feel like a lot of students, Martin Luther King Jr. said a quote. He said, at the end of the day, we remember our friends' silence and not our enemies' words. And I truly believe that, like in schools and all my incidents with Islamophobia, I don't remember what the person said, but I just remember the silence of my teachers and my classmates. So like as a teacher, as an educator, if you see harassment, if you see Islamophobia, do not ignore it and speak up, and your students will truly appreciate it. As I said earlier, I run an initiative called Global Islamophobia Awareness Day, and it's all youth-led. And the reason that we made it all youth-led is because as youth, I feel like we have a powerful trait and we can combat Islamophobia because we have the tools and the resources to do so. So what we do is every year we host an awareness day where we educate adults and people on what Islamophobia truly is and what Islam really is. And we go over key topics like the hijab, what Islam truly says about terrorism and other topics. And if teachers would like to come and take this training, it would be amazing. This year, we're going to have our awareness day, May 13th, at the Rainier Culture Center in South Seattle.
Thank you for that, Ahlam. As I was doing research for the webinar, I looked around at local and national efforts to combat Islamophobia, and a couple of ones stuck out to me. One of them was for the Muslims in those communities to organize events to provide a positive community outlet for concerns related to Islamophobia or other forms of intolerance. So, for example, form community groups that promote mutual understanding, using one's own social media to network and promote positive and accurate images of Islam. Introduce yourself to all your neighbors of faith, races, and ethnicities. Attend school board meetings, city council meetings. Submit opinion pieces to your newspaper about a local issue of importance. And invite local community leaders and public to the mosque open houses so that they can see the culture and understand. For other community members that are not Muslim, some tips are to respond to acts of Islamophobia with show of unity. Put differences aside and establish good community relationships so Islamophobia is rejected. Host events like blood drives and health fairs at the local mosque. Get the community center involved in local issues affecting the Muslims. And invite local and national speakers to the community issues at your local mosques, like members of Congress, police chiefs, mayor, city council members. And last but not least, when you do encounter Islamophobia, it's important to document and report it to the appropriate authorities so that it can be documented and taken care of, because we all deserve to live in a safe environment. As we bring our webinar to a close, we want to thank you again for joining us this afternoon and bearing with us through all the technical difficulties. We hope this webinar has given you an understanding of the impact of Islamophobia on students and how to combat it. We would welcome your feedback on this webinar. We will gather any questions and comments and we'll respond as soon as possible. Also expect material like this presentation and an extensive resource list that we've compiled to be posted on the OEO website at oeo.wa.gov. Thank you for joining us and have a great day.